Hey everybody, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. As ever, I'm Dr. Erin.
Dr. Kristen.
And we are here with our continuing coverage of things related to the ladies of suffrage throughout history, because we're filling time between now and The Crown Season 4, and we like to talk about this stuff. So we just finished our coverage of the And Nothing Less podcast, which you will find directly before this video on our streaming playlist. And now we are talking about an individual movie produced in or released in 2004 called Iron-Jawed Angels, which is the most 2004 feeling 1910s suffrage movie I've ever seen.
When you open up a film with vertical horizon, you know exactly what you're getting. And, you know, in that way, they didn't lie. They lied about a lot of other things.
Yeah.
They didn't lie about it being produced in 2004. So,
yeah.
As we have talked about repeatedly for months now, suffrage is a really complicated conversation that involves a lot of different competing interests and unified interests. When this movie picks up in 1911, 1912, which they never actually clarify, we are, about 60 years into this conversation.
Yeah.
And 2 to 3 generations into this conversation. And yet they made the choice to focus on one strand of the narrative.
Uh-huh.
And we spend the movie following Alice Paul, who was a radical suffrage activist from New Jersey, where everything is legal, and whose tactics were certainly a part of why we got suffrage.
Uh-huh.
But despite what the movie would have you believe, are not entirely why we got suffrage.
Correct.
And they took some liberties with her life.
A little bit.
And they tried to tell a whole lot of stories, and as far as I'm concerned, then only told about one well.
Yeah, and they framed it in this generational kind of conflict, which I think there probably was some truth to, but it was an opportunity to flesh out these people, and they really only fleshed out the younger people like Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who come to heads with Carrie she's got a middle name in there. Chapman? Yeah. Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Shaw, who are, at this stage, Susan B. Anthony is dead, but these women were her, cohort. And, they're both presidents during this time period of the NASA, National Association of Women's Suffrage or something. No, yes, there's another A in there. But, and they play them off each other as this, we're the forward-thinking young people, and you're the old, stuck-in-the-mud people. And there's no, it was just a really tired argument and not a true one from what we know. And it essentialized it in a way that made it more petty than I think it was. And we spent way too much time on it, especially for something that wasn't true.
Or if it was, which Elaine Weiss seems to hint that it might have been, but also this is just, the script was not written by anybody who knew how people talked in 1910. It was still a it was all anachronistic. It was all that. And it was a giant waste of Angelica Houston, and a waste of Margaret Martindale.
How dare they waste those women?
Giant waste. And it just didn't, I think there was a lot of pettiness, because I think there was, Alice Paul was, by all accounts, was a strident woman. Carrie Catt, by all accounts, was fairly strident, and I'm sure they butted heads.
And legitimately, there's a reason Alice Paul ended up forming the National Women's Party and breaking with NASA. They did conflict over the ways that you can protest for suffrage. So that's a real thing, but to make it this oh, these women are old and they don't know what they're talking about. Like, this is the new way now.
Yeah. So the problem, I mean, like the problem with it really is that they framed it from Alice's POV.
Yeah.
So by not, and didn't, so this is also where we need to say that if we had watched this in 2004, this would have essentially, we would have thought Alice Paul was the reason we had suffrage and would have been the greatest movie we had ever seen. Yeah. And when I watched it in 2008 even, I was like, oh, this is amazing, because I didn't know any of it. And it's really hard to be critical of things when you don't know anything.
You don't know anything. Yeah. So no, I thought about it because this movie came out when we were both, when we were 21. And 21-year-old Erin would have thought this was the best thing since sliced bread, and would have gone down a deep dive rabbit hole of obsession with Alice Paul and believed all of these things because we were not taught to be critical about it. And because this movie is like, by the end you get to it and it's lovely and inspirational and you're like, oh, these women fought so hard for our right to vote. And then 37-year-old Erin has learned that like they never wanted Black women to have that vote. And the only reason it passed was because of Jim Crow and racism. And like all of these complicated narratives that were a part of this inspirational story that we are not taught to critically think about at all.
Ever.
We're not taught about it at all. So
yeah, we're not taught about it at all. So I would have no trouble if they wanted to say this was a movie about Alice Paul.
Yeah.
And so some of this, and very well, the director or the screenwriter could have said that, and HBO marketed it as a movie about suffrage, like, you know, that kind of thing. They did call the media did call Alice Paul and her patriots iron-jawed angels. They did. And it was an insult. And they were absolutely the ones who went on hunger strike, and her inspiration was drawn from old Ireland. And all of that is true. They are the ones that were the sentinels at the White House. And she did burn chunks of President Wilson's speeches like they show in the movie. And she is a real reason why the public outcry for suffrage turned. Starving and force-feeding women was not a good look for the DC government.
Not when you were standing up and fighting internationally for the right for people to choose their own governments.
Their government. So it just wasn't a good look, and they called him out on it, and like all of this was true, but it was also true that probably 3 of the states that ratified would not have ratified the amendment if the groundwork had not been being laid for 30, 40 to 50 years. It wouldn't have been the same. One of the things that Dr. Erin and I have learned about movements in particular is that movements like this often need multiple strands to make them work. They need complicated narratives, and movements that are too unified in tactic tend to fail, because humans are complicated and massive. You need to be unified in message, but there's usually divisions in tactics. And the suffrage happened was, yes, because of Jim Crow and racism, because it's the history of America. But it also happened because there were a lot of different ways that we did politics for a long time. And to lionize and even deify Alice Paul in this movie, especially the fictionalized version of Alice Paul, we're going to get to Patrick Dempsey in a minute, is a disservice to the narrative that I'm sure in 2004 seemed really cool and really wise, and in 2020 makes me kind of grumpy, because it's just such a cheap shot. This was the easy story to tell, I guess.
Yeah, and like one of the things that we talk about a lot on this channel, right, is that you need to think about the scope of your story and like tell the simple story well. Don't try and tell the big story badly. And so this was such a huge story to tell, even in a 2.5-hour movie, especially knowing that your audience had like a 0% level of previous knowledge.
Yeah.
Aside from maybe remembering that Susan B. Anthony was on a dollar coin and, you know, little tidbits throughout American history. So they had a steep hill to climb. So they could have made a smaller story and done a better job of it. The last hour of this movie is stunning. From the Silent Sentinels through the hunger strike, that is the story that gripped me. That is the story that inspired me. tell me that story more succinctly, and leave room for ambiguity, leave room for complexity, and like ask some critical questions. Because the thing, as you were talking about this right now, that I thought of was like, we're getting more of these types of movies and TV shows made now. But for a long time, women had to fight tooth and nail to get any of their stories told by Hollywood. And so it feels like such a wasted opportunity in 2004. Like, we didn't get another opportunity. There wasn't another suffrage movie made until the one that we're going to cover next week, made about British suffragettes. Like, what, 11 years later, 12 years later? So like, you're going to get one shot at this. But also, it was a movie of its time. Did we have a lot of critical race theory happening in Hollywood in 2004? Not so much.
We definitely seem to think it was like the anachronistic, like modern music was having a moment. Like, isn't this the same year Knight's Tale came out, where we thought it was really cool to play We Will Rock You?
I think it was 2004. It was definitely.
So like, it just felt like I was watching this on.
A Knight's Tale was earlier because we were still in high school, but it was like this period of yes.
Okay. I just, like, as I was watching this, I was like, I don't believe this was on HBO. This had to be on MTV. Like, it was such an MTV
made for the MTV generation.
Yeah. So one of the really, truly, like, made my face go was that they added a romance for Alice. Alice Paul kind of very famously was never involved with anyone romantically.
They didn't get married. No major, like, we don't have a lot of her letters, but no major relationships of anybody of any sex that we can tell.
And people that study her closely are clear that she was dedicated to the cause above anything else.
Yep.
And the only criticisms that this movie got, besides like the stylistic choices of playing Fiona Apple and Vertical Horizon, were about this romance that they shoehorned in with Patrick Dempsey at the height of his powers, at the height of his McDreamy powers.
He's so very Patrick Dempsey in this.
Oh my gosh. This had to be like right after Sweet Home Alabama and right before McDreamy, because it is like...
It is, I think it's like Sweet Home Alabama, heart.
Yeah,
like,
and also...
Patrick Dempsey, but you waste Angelica Houston. Like, okay.
Sure. That boy cannot play period pieces.
No, he was 100%. 2004 Patrick
like
Dempsey.
His hair was wrong, his clothes might have been right, but like the charm, the language, the Jesus hell. Like,
yeah. And like, I understand why they inserted it, because they wanted to show us that Alice Paul was going to choose the movement. But you know what? They already told us that, and I believed them. She had that whole conversation with
Lucy
Burns,
yep.
her BFF. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like, I get you. Lucy's like, and it was an important conversation to have. Like, what does an activist life look like? What does a suffragist look like? Can you be a suffragist and be a mom?
Yeah.
And that whole fictionalized story of the senator's wife was a great way to showcase that complexity. I did not need this will they or won't they, because I knew they won't. And you're wasting precious minutes on something that is not necessary for the exposition of the point you're trying to make.
Yeah, and it was, I just like sat here like checking my watch the whole time. But again, and what's interesting is when I think back on this movie, because I watched it in 2008. I got it on disc from Netflix.
Hey.
I don't remember anything but the hunger strike. Like, that's what stuck with me, because until that moment, it had never occurred to me that women were arrested trying to get the vote, and that they were forced fed. And so I remember once I saw that, having a conversation, because I saw it just before the 2008 election, and having conversations with students, because I was on staff at a university, about how every woman had to vote because women went on hunger strike for us to have the right to vote. That's what stuck with me. I don't remember Patrick Dempsey being in this movie. I don't remember anything about Angelica Houston. I don't remember anything. I remembered it was Hilary Swank, and I remember that she was force-fed, and that's it. And so in a very real way, if that's all people remember from this movie, I'm okay with it. I would like us to make more of these movies.
Yeah.
So that we can tell more stories.
More stories. Desperately waiting for the script about Ida B. Wells' life to become a movie, because it's been out there for decades and somebody's trying to get it across the line.
Yeah.
And we're having a
come on, Oprah.
Like Nicole Hannah-Jones.
Yeah.
Like she's got we're changing street names to Ida B. Wells in Chicago. Like, let's make this happen. So yeah, there's a lot of, and we've gotten into in previous parts of the podcast discussion about Ida B. Wells and that famous moment with the parade. It was badly done in this film because at no point did Alice Paul think it was a good idea. At no point did she secretly let Ida sneak into the march and I've avoided controversy by letting it happen. No, she said, you're not going to be in it and I'm not going to allow it. And Ida was the one that said, screw you, I'm doing it anyway.
Yeah.
So what we needed to, again, this movie is the POV is Alice Paul is the hero. But heroes are imperfect people as well. So I would like this movie with an asterisk. I'm really glad they made it. What will always stick with me was the last hour of the Silent Sentinels and what those women were willing to do and sacrifice. What I would love is an epilogue that shows them shutting the door in Black suffragists' face 4 years later when they came to them and said, we need your help. Because that is the big picture. That is the whole picture, is that once white educated women, we should say, middle-class white educated women got that barrier removed so that they could be enfranchised, they turned their back on women of color and low-income white women and said no.
And very much became convinced that as long as we had the constitutional provision to not be blocked, we wouldn't be blocked on anything else. You don't see any of these women go on to be anti-gerrymandering. You don't see any of them, it was there. It didn't inspire further movements, which is fascinating. I don't understand why.
Whiteness is a hell of a drug is my answer. I don't know.
Yeah, but I guess yes, but also there has to be something else, because yes, but they can't say that, so what?
Yeah.
How did it not inspire anybody, I guess, is my question, because what happened? I mean, maybe the answer is World War II, maybe the answer is the Great Depression, maybe that's the answer.
Maybe.
And so that now that I'm talking out loud, I bet you that's a huge part of the answer. But we stopped talking about voting rights for 40 years.
Yeah. Until after,
until the 60s.
Until the 60s. And we know, obviously, Black and brown people were advocating against and fighting against Jim Crow throughout this time. But, yeah, and, it's a whole other rant for us to talk about the lack of white allyship for a long time in these movements. But it's a huge missing chunk from this movie.
And if they weren't, as far as I'm concerned, if you aren't going to dive into that, don't have Ida show up in the office. If you're not going to tell the story, then don't tell the story.
Yeah.
Why'd you bother casting Ida Wells for 2 scenes?
Yeah. Why'd you name her at all? You could have told the entire story of this movie and not shown that point, because all it left me with now was questions about, well, what happened to those Black women? What, where were they? Why weren't they involved with Alice Paul? What happened to them after the 20th? We never see a lady of color again. And so, yeah, if you're not going to talk about it, don't talk about it. But yeah, that was the thing that I was left with at the end. I was like, that hour is some of the most powerful film I've seen of the women's experience in the United States. And I would like more like it, please.
Yeah, for sure. So recommended with an asterisk, as long as you realize that this is, an eighth of the story at best. Ignore everything with Patrick Dempsey. Watch Sweet Home Alabama instead.
Exactly.
And we'll be back next week with a movie that also leaves some holes, but at least does a better job of keeping to the historical narrative. So
yeah, so we're gonna watch Suffragette, which is what the suffragists were called in the UK, starring Carey Mulligan. It's available on Netflix if anybody would like to watch it with us. I've seen it a few years ago, so I'm excited to rewatch it with the critical lens, and learn more about British suffrage and kind of these women that inspired Alice Paul. So we'll see.
So we'll see you then.
Bye.
Enjoy your week, guys.